Freedom is not the absence of struggle, nor the serene lull of agreement. It is the violent eruption of the will asserting itself against the chains that bind it. To crave freedom yet flee conflict is a contradiction born of weakness and illusion. You seek the light of autonomy, but shrink from the shadows of opposition, as if true liberty could be won in silence and peace. No, freedom demands that you meet conflict face to face, embrace it, wrestle with it, and emerge transformed. The coward fears conflict because it threatens the comfortable lies he tells himself, because it exposes the frailty of the self he has built on false certainties. But the warrior, the philosopher, the free spirit knows that conflict is the crucible in which the soul is forged, the fire that tempers strength, the pain that reveals truth. Without conflict, the spirit becomes stagnant, a prisoner in the gilded cage of complacency and conformity. To be truly free, you must learn to welcome opposition, not as a curse, but as a necessary force, because it shatters illusions, tests convictions, and reveals the depths of your resolve. Freedom is born from the struggle against those who would impose their will on you, and even more profoundly, from the struggle within yourself, the clash between the self you are and the self you must become. Nietzsche would remind you that to deny conflict is to deny life itself, for life is will to power, a constant becoming, a relentless overcoming. To avoid conflict is to choose slavery over sovereignty, submission over mastery, silence over the roar of your own existence. Therefore, if you desire freedom, cultivate the courage to face conflict, to endure it, and to wield it as a force of creation rather than destruction. Only then will you break the chains of fear and step into the radiant chaos of true liberation. True freedom cannot exist without conflict. They are bound together like fire and steel, each shaping and defining the other. To imagine freedom as a peaceful, effortless state is to misunderstand the very nature of existence and the human spirit. Without conflict, there is no movement, no growth, no becoming, only a stagnant, lifeless stillness that masquerades as peace. The serene surface of tranquility may appear desirable, but beneath it lies the decay of the spirit, the atrophy of will. Nietzsche understood that life itself is a battlefield, a ceaseless struggle of forces vying for expression and dominance. The will to power, the fundamental driving force of all living beings, is realized through conflict. It is through struggle that the self is tested, refined, and elevated beyond its prior limits. Those who fear conflict cling desperately to safety and conformity, seeking to avoid the wounds and chaos that confrontation inevitably brings. But in doing so, they surrender their vitality and become prisoners of a false peace, a peace imposed not by strength, but by avoidance and submission. Real freedom demands that one faces conflict boldly, embracing the tumult as the necessary arena in which the soul's true strength is revealed. Conflict forces you to confront not only external adversaries, but also the internal contradictions, doubts, and fears that reside within. It demands that you wrestle with the very essence of who you are and who you strive to become. In this wrestling match, illusions fall away and what remains is raw, unfiltered selfhood. The absence of conflict is the absence of this transformative fire. Without it, the self calcifies and dies. Consider the artist, the philosopher, the warrior, all those who have carved their names into history. They have done so not through avoidance but through confrontation. They have seized conflict as a means to assert their will, to challenge the status quo, and to create something new and powerful. To live without conflict is to live without challenge, and without challenge there can be no true mastery, no real freedom. The fear of conflict is, therefore, the fear of life itself. It is a refusal to engage with the chaos that is the very condition of existence. Yet, paradoxically, it is in the heart of this chaos that freedom is found, not as a quiet repose, but as a roaring affirmation of one's own will and power. When you embrace conflict, you no longer see it as a threat, but as an essential partner in your journey toward liberation. It is the force that shatters illusions, awakens strength, and compels you to rise beyond what you thought possible. In this way, freedom and conflict are not enemies. They are inseparable companions on the path of becoming. To reject conflict is to reject freedom. To embrace it is to claim your birthright as a sovereign being. The fear of conflict is rooted deeply in our attachment to comfort and the false certainties that shield us from the rawness of reality. We build walls of illusion around ourselves, craving security and predictability, but these walls are fragile facades that crumble at the first sign of confrontation. Conflict threatens to expose the fragility beneath our carefully constructed identities, forcing us to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world. This fear is not merely about avoiding pain, it is about resisting transformation. When conflict arises, it demands that we question long-held beliefs, confront our own limitations, and step into the unknown. Such demands unsettle the ego, which prefers stability, control, and the maintenance of a coherent narrative about who we are. In this sense, fear of conflict is fear of self-exposure and the dissolution of illusions that give us a sense of safety. Nietzsche saw this as a profound challenge to the individual, to overcome the paralysis that fear imposes and to recognize conflict as an opportunity rather than a threat. When you fear conflict, you are clinging to a version of yourself that is incomplete, a self that avoids discomfort at the cost of growth. This avoidance leads to stagnation, where life becomes a series of compromises and half-truths designed to keep the peace rather than to pursue authenticity. But to live authentically is to accept that conflict is inevitable and necessary. It is the crucible through which true strength and freedom are forged. When you stop fearing conflict, you stop fearing change, challenge, and the unfolding of your potential. You begin to understand that the discomfort conflict brings is a sign of life moving within you, a signal that you are on the path toward deeper self-realization. This shift in perspective transforms conflict from a source of dread into a powerful catalyst for growth. It is no longer something to evade, but something to engage with courageously. In embracing conflict without fear, you reclaim your power to shape your own destiny rather than being shaped by the forces that seek to control you. Nietzsche's philosophy calls you to become the Übermensch, not a being who lives in tranquil complacency, but one who dances boldly with conflict, wielding it as a tool for self-overcoming and liberation. Only by shedding the fear of conflict can you step fully into this role and claim the freedom that comes from mastering both the external world and the tempest within. The nature of conflict is not to be feared, but to be embraced as the necessary catalyst for profound self-examination and growth. Conflict forces you to confront the illusions you have constructed around yourself, those comforting stories that shield you from uncomfortable truths. It strips away pretense and demands that you see yourself and the world with unflinching clarity. In this exposure, you are compelled to question your values, your beliefs, and your motivations. Conflict acts as a mirror, reflecting both your strengths and your weaknesses, your convictions and your doubts. It pushes you beyond complacency, challenging the status quo of your existence and demanding that you choose. Will you remain trapped in familiar patterns, or will you dare to transform? This process is neither easy nor painless. It often brings discomfort, anxiety, and a sense of upheaval, but these are the necessary fires in which the soul is purified and strengthened. Without such trials, the spirit remains immature, tethered to illusions that limit its freedom. Nietzsche's vision of the free individual, the Übermensch, she is one who embraces conflict as an essential part of life's becoming. To avoid conflict is to avoid the very opportunities that lead to greater authenticity and power. In the struggle itself, you find the raw material to forge a stronger self, capable of facing life's uncertainties with courage and creativity. Conflict breaks down old constraints and creates space for new possibilities. It awakens the dormant forces within, calling forth your deepest will to power, the drive to overcome, to assert, to create. Thus, conflict is not destruction, but creation in disguise. It is the crucible in which freedom is born, where the spirit is tested and refined, where the individual transcends limitation and claims sovereignty over their own existence. By welcoming conflict rather than fleeing it, you step into the dynamic process of self-overcoming, shedding the chains of fear and stepping into the radiant chaos of true freedom. Conflict is often perceived as a force of destruction, something to be avoided at all costs in the pursuit of peace and stability. Yet, this misunderstanding obscures the deeper truth. Conflict is not the enemy of order, but its very foundation. The order that arises without conflict is brittle and superficial, built on avoidance and denial rather than engagement and growth. Nietzsche taught us that life is a dynamic interplay of opposing forces, a dance of creation and destruction, affirmation and negation. To seek freedom while shunning conflict is to desire a stillness that can never truly exist, to crave a harmony that is merely the silence before decay. True order emerges only through the tension of conflict, where competing wills test one another and the strongest, most authentic expression emerges. This struggle is not merely external, it is also internal, as the self grapples with its own contradictions, doubts, and fears. The refusal to engage these inner conflicts leaves the spirit fragmented and weak, vulnerable to the illusions that pacify but do not liberate. When you accept conflict as an inevitable and necessary process, you open yourself to transformation. You learn to see opposition not as a threat but as a teacher, one that challenges you to sharpen your resolve, clarify your values, and deepen your understanding. Freedom is born in this crucible of tension, forged through the willingness to confront pain, ambiguity, and resistance. Without conflict, growth stalls, and the soul becomes imprisoned by complacency and conformity. To embrace conflict is to embrace life itself in its fullest, most potent form, a life of courage, intensity, and profound self-realization. Only through this embrace can you break free from the chains of fear and step into the power and sovereignty that true freedom demands. Avoiding conflict is not a sign of peace, but a surrender to the forces that seek to dominate and control you. When you shy away from confrontation, you give power to those who would impose their will upon you, silently consenting to your own subjugation. This avoidance breeds weakness, not strength, and it fosters a life lived in shadow rather than in light. Nietzsche saw this as a form of slavery, not physical chains, but psychological bondage wrought by fear and denial. To refuse conflict is to refuse your own power, to silence the roar of your will beneath the quiet hum of submission. Freedom requires sovereignty over oneself, and sovereignty demands the courage to stand firm in the face of opposition. Those who avoid conflict remain trapped in the safety of complacency, unable to assert their individuality or challenge the injustices around them. They become cogs in a machine, moving not by choice but by compulsion. To break these chains, you must cultivate a fearless embrace of conflict as a necessary arena for asserting your will and defining your identity. In doing so, you reclaim your voice, your strength, and your freedom. You move from being a passive subject to an active creator of your destiny. Avoidance may seem easier in the short term, but it leads only to a deeper captivity. True freedom is won through the struggle, the willingness to confront, to resist, and to endure. Only by facing conflict head-on can you dismantle the structures that bind you and step into the radiant sovereignty that Nietzsche so passionately envisioned. True sovereignty, the full realization of your freedom, demands that you embrace both the external battles with others and the internal struggles within yourself. Nietzsche understood that the greatest conflicts are often those fought in the depths of the soul, where competing desires, fears, and values wage war for dominance. To be free is not merely to overcome outside forces, but to master the turmoil inside. This internal conflict is the arena where your character is forged and your authentic self emerges. Ignoring these inner battles only prolongs suffering and fragmentation, for unresolved contradictions breed anxiety, self-doubt, and paralysis. Sovereignty arises when you face these inner conflicts with courage and honesty, integrating the shadow aspects of yourself and transcending limiting beliefs. It is the process of becoming whole, no longer divided by fear or contradiction, but unified in purpose and will. At the same time, external conflict cannot be avoided. The world is not a place of peace for those who seek freedom. It is a battleground of competing wills and values. Sovereignty requires that you assert yourself, defend your boundaries, and challenge forces that would diminish your autonomy. This does not mean reckless aggression, but a deliberate, conscious engagement with opposition, a dance of power that tests and sharpens your resolve. Freedom is the prize won not by evasion but by engagement, by the willing acceptance of conflict as the means through which you claim your place in the world. To live as a sovereign being is to navigate these dual realms of struggle, external and internal, with grace and strength, recognizing that each conflict is an opportunity to deepen your mastery and claim your freedom. Only by embracing this totality of struggle can you transcend the limitations imposed by fear and step fully into the radiant power of your own becoming. Conflict is not merely a force of destruction. It is the forge in which authentic selfhood and liberation are born. When you embrace conflict, you engage in a dynamic process of creation, one that shatters old limitations and compels you to rise beyond them. It is through the crucible of opposition that the spirit is tested, purified, and ultimately strengthened. Nietzsche viewed this process as the essence of life itself, a relentless becoming, a will to power that drives us to overcome and transcend. Conflict challenges complacency and forces you to confront your deepest fears and desires, pushing you toward greater self-awareness and mastery. Rather than fearing conflict as chaos or loss, you come to see it as the necessary fire that refines your character and liberates your will. In this light, conflict becomes not an enemy, but an indispensable companion on the path to freedom, a catalyst that transforms struggle into strength, pain into growth, and resistance into sovereignty. To fear conflict is to fear life's very pulse. To embrace it is to claim the radiant chaos of your own existence and step boldly into true liberation.